You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. It is Monday, May 19th. The rain was pretty crazy over the week if you were here in Utah. And we're back. We got the sun out. Kids are getting ready to get out of school. I don't know if that's a good thing or bad thing for you. Either way, we're back. So happy to be with you today. Every day we're getting closer to more football. I know somebody out there is going to somewhere say the 100 days of football is close approaching. I don't really care. Look, it's getting closer, and we'll talk more of it. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the over-under lines for the Big 12 with a little bit of a schedule prediction, kind of looking at that a little bit. We'll also talk Utah commits as well as official visit season. We're into that point now. And then just as a reminder, I've teased this a few times, but starting next week, we're going to start our schedule breakdown. So we'll essentially take two games each week and do a deeper dive on them, kind of see how Utah should approach it, kind of what to look for. So next week, we'll start with UCLA and Cal Poly. Utah starts on the road at UCLA in the Rose Bowl and then comes home for the only non-conference game at home against Cal Poly. This will lead us essentially all the way to the Big 12 Media Days. So I hope you're looking forward to that. We'll get into that. Maybe later this week, we'll even get into a little bit more college football talk in terms of general terms. There's a lot going on right now in relation to the NCAA settlement, the House settlement, as well as the college football playoff talk. I'm kind of expanding that. We'll see if anything moves. I don't have anything scheduled this week to do that, but if we get some more information there's been some things happening, and it'll relate to Utah. But right now, we're just going to go with this as the only podcast this week. So we'll see how this goes. Either way, next week we'll start that schedule breakdown. But today we'll talk a little bit of that with the over-under lines and other stuff that way. But before we do that, let me tell you about our partners. Every possibility begins with a spark, and possibility can grow into something even better than expected. With a clear view of what matters most, your possibilities are endless. From its first flicker at the University of Utah, UFirst Credit Union has grown to meet its potential and ignites your possibilities. They've grown into Canyon View Credit Union. Same roots, new path. Welcome to Canyon View Credit Union. Check out the full details at canyonviewcu.com. All right, we're going to jump into this. And for a little bit of fun, this is the time of the year where everybody wants to talk about kind of how the schedule breaks down, the position groups, the different things that way. The transfer portal has essentially kind of grinded to a halt. People may still get picked up, but for the most part, how teams look right now is how they're going to look in the fall, right? And so it's now where we can start kind of looking at how things are going to go. So I have to remind people that just because a team finished strong last year doesn't mean that that's going to be how they start the next year. Just because a team was bad last year doesn't mean that that's how they're going to start this next year, right? Especially in this era of the transfer portal, and especially with teams that are taking on a whole bunch of new talent or losing talent or whatever that may be, it's getting harder and harder to predict at a consistent basis on what these teams are going to look like, right? You may have a team that's been consistent and they may fall. You could look at Oklahoma State for an example. They've been one of the most consistent teams in the Big 12 for a long time and just couldn't put it together, right? And so you have instances like that. I would say look at trends more than anything in terms of how a program is run. Obviously, stability in the coaching staff, stability in how they approach things, that's going to be more of a telltale sign than 1 year over each other, right? And so, there's a lot going into this, and we're gonna jump into this. We talked about this a couple weeks ago when I had John Kurtz on about the parity in the Big 12. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, you can decide that. As it stands, though, this year it is shaping up to be pretty similar in terms of how last year was, where a lot of teams are going to be in play, and there's going to be a lot to kind of follow. And there's not one clear, defined team that says, hey, this is who it's going to be. A lot of people are going to look at Arizona State as maybe that team. There's some other teams that maybe others could make a case for that. But the reality is this is wide open, and there's a lot of teams that are going to compete, and I'll get into that in just a sec on what that means. So, but just for fun, with the world that we live in, everybody wants to use ChatGPT or any of these other AI tools, and it's getting more sophisticated, and it's looking at different things, and honestly, a lot of this is going to come from the internet and other stuff. That's how these things are generated. But I was curious, and last night I ran a little test on the AI machine, and wanted to see what the machine viewed as the toughest Big 12 schedules for all these teams, right, and rank them. And so looking at this, and look, this is AI. There's a lot of factors that go into it. This isn't somebody that's assessing it fully. It's more just pulling data and trying to extrapolate some sort of rankings. So take it for what it's worth. But I think looking at this list, I think there has some value there. Obviously, these are all based on projections. It's easy in May to be able to say, oh, X team is going to be, 10-2 or whatever it may be. We thought Florida State was going to be a great team last year, and look what happened. So we thought Utah was going to win the Big 12 last year, and look what happened. So it's not always an exact science, and that's what's great about this sport. But it's just kind of fun. So looking at this, the AI response gave me TCU with the toughest schedule, Utah with the number 2 toughest schedule. I don't know if it's that tough, but I think there is some difficulties there. And as part of that, Utah gets most of their tough games at home. So we'll see there. West Virginia, number 3, Arizona 4, Iowa State at number 5, Colorado at 6, Baylor 7, Kansas State 8, BYU 9, Houston 10, Kansas 11, Cincinnati 12, UCF 13, Texas Tech 14, Oklahoma State 15, and Arizona State as 16. And as we get into this in just a second, Arizona State and Texas Tech especially are going to be near the top of these over-under lines. There's a lot of optimism about these two teams specifically, and there's more teams here. But if they have a lot of optimism and their schedule is pretty good, or at least favorable, that could mean some good things for those two teams. And so, strength of schedule and the difficulty there is always a challenge. But it's fascinating to kind of see how this will shape up. And kind of look at it. So let's jump into the over-under lines. They're via Circa Sports. I like to go to Circa Sports. It's a Vegas sports book. Puts out some pretty good lines that I like to follow throughout the year. There's many ones. You can go to FanDuel. You can go to the overseas ones. We'll get some of those. But for the most part, these are generally a kind of a consensus look at kind of how Vegas is viewing these teams. And this is for the season. This isn't for the conference play. This is for the full season. So as you take a look at the Big 12, those numbers are going to be relatively low. But at the same time, they're all jumbled, and you can make a case for the over on many of these teams. And so it's going to be a real challenge to kind of predict how this will go. And we're going to try to break that down a little bit. So as it stands, 8 teams have a 7.5 wins or better odds. 3 of those teams are at the top with 8.5. So the fact that 8.5 is your ceiling is pretty crazy. It's kind of showing that Vegas thinks that the Big 12 is once again going to be a mess in a good competitive way, but one in which it's tough to predict, right? And so if you really feel strongly about a certain team, maybe you could win some money at a certain location. Obviously, I'm not here to advocate for that. That is against the law in Utah legally, but there's ways. But as it stands, this is part of the nomenclature of sports anymore. We talk betting lines; it becomes part of the standard thing, whether you bet or not. It's more of just an indication of kind of how Vegas, people who stake their reputation and claim on everything, to be able to look at a situation and say, hey, what do you think it is, right? Obviously, Vegas and all these other sports books are going to lose money. They're also going to win a lot more. And so, you look at these and it becomes an interesting situation to kind of pick what you can do. And, sometimes Vegas looks absolutely stupid, right? Like if you pick a team to be 7.5 wins and they go out and win 11 games, yeah, it looked like a completely stupid thing. But this, once again, is a look in May based on how these teams are expected to be and projected. So really fascinating, really fun to look at, but we'll see. And I honestly think this is how the Big 12 is going to continue to look year over year until one team starts to pull away, right? If it's Arizona State, if it's Kansas State, Texas Tech, Utah, BYU, whatever it may be, these numbers are going to consistently be kind of lower and be more on par with a lot of other teams because there hasn't been one team that just dominates, right? This isn't a conference like a Georgia or an Ohio State where, generally speaking, you're going to go into that and say, 9.5, 10.5 wins is kind of the floor. This is going to be one of those things where this is consistently 7.5, 8.5 type wins because there's just been so much parity. And so until a team starts pulling away year over year, I would argue maybe 3 years worth, I think Vegas is going to, take the safe bet and try to make it this way. So let's jump into this. So starting with the top 3 teams that have 8.5 wins as a projection for an over and under is Arizona State, Kansas State, and Texas Tech. You could make a case for any one of these teams being at the top. Obviously, Arizona State is the defending champions, came from the bottom and rose to the top. They're a team that has 79% of their returning production. That's number 2 in the country. So this is a team that is bringing back a majority of that championship roster. And so I think that tells a lot about what people think about Arizona State. I wouldn't be at all surprised if Arizona State is the betting favorite coming out of the conference just simply because of all that. But you could absolutely make a case for Kansas State. You can make a case for Texas Tech, which clearly has spent a ton of money going into the transfer portal to get top-end talent. So, it'll be interesting here. So looking at Arizona State, though, going through their schedule, to me, I see their wins as, Northern Arizona. That's your FCS game. You got Texas State at home, TCU at home. TCU could be a tough challenge with Hoover as quarterback. Obviously, he was one of the best in the country in passing yards. TCU still hasn't kind of found its footing since its national championship run, not championship, but championship appearance. And they just haven't been able to kind of consistently put it together. So it could be a tough game, but Arizona State gets them at home, and I'm kind of predicting that right now as a win. They get Houston at home. They could probably win that one. Houston is on the up and up, but I don't think they've done enough to get there. West Virginia is going to be looked at as the worst team in the conference. There's a lot of change, a lot of turnover there, and so that one's going to be a challenge. And then the only real road game that they've got that I think is kind of a win is at Colorado. Colorado's still kind of a mystery. They could be better. They could be worse. It's hard to predict them. And then I'm tossing in Arizona as a win. You get them at home. Arizona State has been the better team. I probably should put this in the toss-up category, but I'm going to count it as a win. And so I think, Arizona State has a good path. What is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 games right there that I'm predicting as a win. That gets you almost to that 8.5 number. So it's going to be an interesting situation there. Like I said, Colorado could go one way or the other depending on how they are. That's later in the season. Arizona, it's a rivalry game. You never know how that goes, but I think Arizona State right now is on the upward trajectory, whereas Arizona's not. That's not to say these teams couldn't flip or things could change, but that's just kind of how I see it as it stands today. Toss-up games for the Sun Devils. They go on the road to Mississippi State, and Mississippi State honestly hasn't been in a good situation lately. This is not a game that you look at and you say, oh, you're dreading going to an SEC school. But with that said, this is still a tough game, right? I don't know that you can predict this one either way. Going on the road, I believe, if I remember right, I didn't put this in my notes, that this is the first game of the season. Maybe it was NIU. Either way, it's one of the first few games of the season, and anything can go sideways. So If you get a jump and beat an SEC school, that's going to give you some momentum, and we'll see how that goes. But tough game nonetheless. Then they have Texas Tech at home. Once again, another good opportunity for them. And then they have at Iowa State on the road. Iowa State is a tricky team, depending on when you play them, depending on what's going on. They've obviously been a team that's, hovered around that 10-win season every year. Last year was the first year I believe they ever got that. But this is a team it's been consistently good. They've been able to do well with Matt Campbell there. So this one's a toss-up to me. To me, the two losses that I have kind of circled right now, and this is once again based on projections, one at Baylor. I think Baylor is going to be a tough out for a lot of teams this year. That's not an easy environment to play, especially now that Baylor's starting to kind of pick up its momentum. Came into the season last year really hot, or at the end of the season, yes. At the end of the season came in hot, and has a great quarterback in Sawyer Robertson that is probably been looked at as one of the best in terms of his momentum from the Big 12. So you've got that. And then I'm saying at Utah. Utah obviously is a tough environment to play. Assuming that Utah is the team that we expect them to be, I just don't see Arizona State coming out there with a win. You could argue that Utah was into that game on the road with a very, hurt Cam Rising, and for the most part was able to hold serve until late in the game. And I think Utah is going to be better in every facet of that game. We'll see. So that's kind of what it is. This isn't, me playing a Utah homer card by any means. I just don't see this as an easy game for Arizona State. It's a tough road game. And we'll see. But either way, you're predicting at least 8 to 10 wins for this Arizona State squad. It's pretty easy to look at them as an over category here. But I think this is also a scenario too where it's easy to kind of read your own clippings, kind of get high on yourself. This is where Arizona State now has to find out, can they play the top dog, right? Last year they kind of snuck in. They were good, don't get me wrong, but they kind of snuck in the sense that most people weren't expecting them, right? You look at that and you say, Arizona State, they were picked last. We don't need to really prepare as hard. It's just kind of these psyche things that happen, and suddenly Arizona State, you get late in the season and they're this good team. And once you've built that momentum, Kenny Dillingham had things rolling, it's tough to pull back. They also bring back Sam Leavitt, has been a dynamic quarterback, obviously is getting a ton of praise. He had a lot of help with Cam Scattaboo, but he's a quarterback that a lot of people are looking at to be kind of one of the top tier-ish type QBs. ESPN actually came out with a ranking of the quarterback rooms today, and they listed Sam Leavitt in the tier 2, which they deemed as pretty darn good. You can go read that on ESPN. It's just on their homepage. But they see Sam Leavitt as probably one of the better quarterbacks in the Big 12. So Arizona State, interesting. I would take the over right now as it stands, but curious to see how they manage this as they go on. Now, as I go through the rest of these teams, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on each team. I'm actually only going to talk about the 8 teams that have the 7.5 wins or better. Utah is included in that range, and we'll get to them in a minute. But I don't want to sit here and bore you with all these teams and go through that. Arizona State, I went a little deeper on that just simply because they are probably the favorite. It is what it is. So let's jump to Kansas State. 8.5 wins as well. Obviously, you have Avery Johnson at QB. Still kind of the up and coming QB that people expect. Lost some of his luster last year and kind of how things went. But there's still a lot of optimism for him. ESPN ranked his quarterback room in tier 6, though. Second time's the charm is what they're calling it. Kansas State, I see them winning North Dakota, Army at Arizona, UCF, TCU at Oklahoma State, and bringing Colorado at home. Losses, or I should say toss-ups, a neutral game for Iowa State. This is overseas. Go to Baylor, go to Kansas. They also have Texas Tech at home. Those are tough. This is a team where trajectory in terms of the last few years would argue that they should be over that 8.5, at least 9. But you could make a case where they could only win 7 games this year. Losses right now, I have another one at Utah. That one is still, I kind of wanted to put that one more in the toss-up. I'm not entirely sure, but I think Utah can play against Kansas State in a good way. And look, I'm not putting every team as a loss against Utah. It just so happens that these two teams were there. So look, that's how it goes. But, Kansas State going to be in the mix. I'm not as confident to put an over prediction on them, but I think they absolutely have what it takes to be able to get there. I just think they have enough tough games that it's going to be a challenge for them. Texas Tech, this is one of the most interesting teams in the Big 12 simply because of what they've done in the portal season. They went and spent a ton of money. They brought in a ton of talent and are looking to really upgrade in every facet of the game. And if that all comes together with their number 4 returning production team with 75%, that could be, really dangerous for a lot of these teams in the Big 12. Texas Tech absolutely can win this conference. The more I've looked at them, because at first, when everybody was saying, oh, Texas Tech, and yeah, you look at the transfer portal, everybody wants to sit here and say, oh, man, like they're the darling. But I fear for them that this kind of is one of those situations like Colorado, right? Where you bring in so much talent because of the name of Deion Sanders, you spend so much money, there's so much attention to you that it becomes so much more of a pressure cooker to be able to be good. They were decent last year. They were in the mix coming down to the wire, but they just weren't good enough to be able to get over the hump. Can they do that this year? We'll see. I have wins over UAPB. I have no idea who that is. It's obviously an FCS school. I wouldn't be surprised if it was like a Division II school. I've never heard of that, but it is what it is. Kent State, one of the worst teams in FBS football. You got them. You got Oregon State at home, at Houston, Kansas, Oklahoma State, BYU, UCF, and at West Virginia. Most of those games are at home. Your road games aren't too difficult, I would say, at Houston, at West Virginia. That schedule itself lays up for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 wins right there that I'm predicting, right? Any of those could go sideways, but I think that's pretty easy. I'm saying, BYU is obviously going to be a tough out. You could put that in the toss-up category as well, but I think having BYU at home leads to an advantage there, and so that's why I put them in the win category. But this is a team that easily I can make a case for 9 wins just right there, and you can go over. Toss-ups, I have at Utah, at Arizona State, and at Kansas State. Obviously, 3 other teams that are going to be in the mix for a conference title. I don't have any projected losses. That's not to say that I don't see any losses, but I think this was a tough one where I can't circle this and say, oh, I can guarantee a loss here or whatever it is, because I just don't know enough about Texas Tech and what they're going to do. But with that said, based on projections, based on how these other teams are going to fare, I can see them absolutely getting that over. I can see them being in the mix and seeing them competing for a title, conference title. It's real easy for them to start 3-0 before their first game of the conference season, which is Utah, at Utah. So we'll see. We'll see how that goes. We'll see how these two teams shape up. They've got a QB in Baron Morton. ESPN's listing him as a tier 3 guy. They're calling it the buckle up tier. But this is a guy that has thrown for a lot of yards, 3,300 yards last year, 27 touchdowns, 8 interceptions on 63% completion rate. Was honestly just behind Shadir Sanders and Josh Hoover in yards per game in the Big 12. So he's a good quarterback. There has been some injury history with him. If he gets hurt or if they're not able to do what they need to, what does that mean for this Texas Tech program? But as it stands, this is a team that is by and large on the upward trend, just simply based on what they've spent in the transfer portal. Will it be worth it? We'll see. But I think that's what makes this team so unpredictable compared to the rest. The rest of these teams in this category, we've seen some success over the years. There's been some consistency. Texas Tech is just kind of lurking. So we'll see. Next up, starting in the 7.5 category. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 teams in this category. You could place them anywhere there. So it's Baylor, BYU, Iowa State, Kansas, and Utah. Each of these teams are predicted to win 7.5 games. Once again, you can make a case for all of these teams to make the over, right? 7.5 is a pretty low number in terms of a season win total. But somebody has to lose, right? And so, it's a real tough situation. Baylor, as I said, one of the hottest teams coming into the end of the season. as we saw last year, was not great at the beginning of the year. That Utah game, which was a non-conference game technically, the game that no Utah fan wants to talk about in terms of Cam Rising, it was going sideways really quickly for Baylor. Utah could have been up 50-0 by the end of the third quarter, the way it was going. Things obviously got much closer. It wasn't fully indicative of how that game was playing out. But this is a team that the latter half of the season, if I remember right, they won 6 straight to end the season, really came on strong. And Sawyer Robertson was a big reason for that. ESPN is putting him in tier 2, which is that pretty darn good category. This is a team to watch, right? And they're going to have some interesting situations here where I'm not necessarily predicting losses for them either. This is a team where, anything could happen. And some of these, I'm being generous on a lot of these rankings, right? Like, you could pick losses, but I think it's just such a chaotic situation that it's hard to know. But for them, I have wins against Samford, Arizona State at home. I have them beating them at Oklahoma State, at Cincinnati, UCF, at Arizona, and Houston. So you've got a pretty decent schedule there in terms of being able to get some wins. My toss-ups here are Auburn at SMU, Kansas State at TCU, and then having Utah at home. Any of those could be toss-ups in my opinion. And so I don't know. With that said, 7 to 11 wins I can see. They're ones that I would probably pick the over on. I think they're trending in the upward direction. I think they've got good momentum. They're bringing back a lot of returning production. They're ranked 11th in the country based on that. And so I think there's some upward momentum there to be able to get there. Next, moving on to BYU. BYU, looking at their schedule, they have a pretty good schedule that lays up to get them over that 7.5 wins. I think just based on where they're at, there's a real good chance that they're competing for a title again. They're in the mix. How some of those close games that they got, one possession games, do they flip the opposite way? We'll see. It's hard to predict those things, but I also think that BYU, coming into last year, there wasn't a lot of optimism outside of the program to be able to say that they could be good, and so there was a lot of belief inside. How does that change going into year 2 of this growth, right? It's easy to surprise people. I don't want to say it's easy, right? Like, college football is hard, so I don't want to say that. I don't want to discredit BYU's success. What I'm saying is I think it's easy in the sense that, a lot of people aren't expecting a lot, but clearly by, the midpoint, there was a lot of expectations for BYU, and so they weren't surprising anybody. That Kansas State game absolutely, changed everything, rejuvenated everything. You then go beat Utah a couple of weeks later. Not that Utah was some powerhouse at that point. Clearly they were down in the dumps, but you start building that upward momentum, and you continue to go, and then you get to the end where you're, essentially one loss away from being in the Big 12 championship game. You then blow out Colorado in a bowl game. I mean, there's clearly a lot of upward momentum here. This is another one of those teams, though, where it's real easy to buy your own press, and you kind of start laxing in how you do things and how you approach it. I don't necessarily believe that BYU is at that point, but that's always the fear, right? It's always harder to play at the top where teams are expecting more from you. As I've said, the wins here, Portland State, Stanford, maybe Stanford's different, but I just don't see anything there. Stanford has not been a good program for the last, 5-6 years. I just don't see BYU having a problem there. Getting the win at East Carolina, at Colorado, West Virginia at home, at Arizona, at Cincinnati, and UCF. I mean, that's a pretty tolerable schedule right there. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 wins right there alone. That gets you to the over. I just, they can go sideways. BYU's had these situations where you travel to East Carolina and something weird happens. Colorado could nip them. Arizona could, there's things, but I don't know. I don't see that really being a situation. So 8 wins, you're already at the over right there. Toss-up games, Utah and TCU. They get them at home, though. Obviously a rocking environment, and if you get momentum, those are really tough environments to play. Utah, you can never predict a win or a loss. That one's always going to be tough. And then TCU, like I said. Losses, I'm putting losses at Iowa State and at Texas Tech. Texas Tech especially, that one's a real tough challenge. I think that's going to be a rocking environment. That's going to be a difficult situation. And then at Iowa State, another tough team. But as it stands, you're right there at the 8. So this is a team that very well could start 6-0 before that Utah game. Colorado was the toughest game of that bunch. And so it becomes a real interesting situation where, if you start 6-0, once again, you get that momentum and you're starting to feel good and things start vibing. And if you're feeling good, it's much easier to win games. So this schedule lays out really well for BYU. Utah fans, if you're hoping for the demise of BYU, it's going to be a challenge, right? There's going to have to be some different things that happen for BYU to not start 6-0. So, take that for what it is. I know that's not what you want to hear, but for if you're a Utah fan, this is going to be another good BYU team, and they've got Jake Retzlaff coming back, who obviously was feeling a little bit better than how it started when he got thrown into it the end of 2 years ago. ESPN is ranking him as a tier 7 QB, or this is the room, right? This isn't just him, but the room in general, which is consistently consistent. So, which I think is a pretty accurate depiction of who Retzlaff is. He hasn't been able to necessarily, go lights out, but he also hasn't been terrible either. It's been pretty consistent. So that's what you need in a QB, and BYU's got that. Last 3, Iowa State. Sorry, going a little long on some of these. Iowa State, 7.5 wins as well. Rocco Becht comes back again. Most of these programs have returning QBs, and that's a big advantage for a lot of them, right? And a lot of them have been pretty consistent, and so it's not a tall task to say that they can be in this mix. Rocco Becht is a tier 2 QB according to ESPN at pretty darn good. But Iowa State has a challenging schedule. Even then, though, I still think that they're more than capable of getting to 8 wins. Their wins I see at South Dakota, or at home against South Dakota, at Arkansas State, Arizona, at Cincinnati, at Colorado, BYU, Kansas, and at Oklahoma State. Their toss-ups to me are the neutral game against Kansas State. Iowa, that one, they got the win last year, but that one's always a tough challenge, similar to like the BYU-Utah. Anytime you have that rivalry, it's tough. And then Arizona State as a toss-up. I have them losing at TCU. There's just something about that game based on how I was looking at this. I can't remember all my rationale as I was doing this, but looking at how the schedule laid up, where it came in the schedule, I just see a loss at TCU. So, that could be up in the night. One of these other ones could be a loss. Obviously, some of those toss-ups or all of those toss-ups could be a loss. It's hard to know. But once again, another team that could win 8 games and get the over. Then there's Kansas. Kansas, started out really rough last year. Jalen Daniels, everybody was excited about. He was healthy, coming back and was able to do well for Kansas. And it really didn't kind of click until the end of the season. Similarly to Baylor, Kansas came in hot at the end of the year. They weren't quite on the same consistency as Baylor, but Kansas, is one of those teams that's still going to be in the mix. I still think they're one that's going to compete for a title. They're one that's going to challenge for that with a good returning roster that can be good. We'll see, right? Like it hasn't been as consistent for them, and so that's been a challenge. Obviously, injury for Jalen Daniels in years past has derailed some things. So we'll see what happens, but I think they have a consistently good program with a head coach that knows how to win. So we'll see what happens there. For me, their wins, Fresno State, Wagner, West Virginia, Cincinnati, at UCF, Oklahoma State, and at Arizona. Pretty manageable schedule, just based on projections. Most of those games come at home, and then your 2 difficult games on the road would be at UCF and at Arizona. Not saying that those can't be difficult environments, but I see Kansas being able to not get overwhelmed by that. Toss-ups, Kansas, or I should say Kansas State. I just put Kansas. They're clearly Kansas, so it's Kansas State. Once again, rivalry at Iowa State, and then Utah. They have to travel to Utah, Utah. Sorry, that's a home game. I apologize for that. This is the last game of the season. It's on Black Friday. Not that means anything, but I think that one's always hard to predict, especially based on how these teams are going to be. Is Utah better? Is Kansas better? How's that going to be? Losses, I predict at Missouri. Missouri's a pretty good team. Obviously, they've been doing really well, been in the top 25 for much of last year. That's going to be a tall task in a non-conference game. And then at Texas Tech, as I've mentioned with them, that one's going to be tough. So they're kind of on the bubble. I think that 7.5 line for them is pretty intriguing. I kind of want to say take the under, but I think there's enough there that they can get the over. What did I say is wins? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So they're right there with just wins that I predicted. I should have done like an actual number next to all these, so I didn't have to count this for you on the podcast. But we are what we are. So right there. Lastly, we'll go with Utah. Utah has also that 7.5. There's a lot to like about Utah, and obviously being able to bounce back. We've talked about this many times. This is obviously a Utah podcast, and so it's easy to understand a lot of these things. But a lot of this is predicated on Devin Dampier being good, the offense being good. But Utah lost a lot of games, in one-possession games, or they snowballed late because Utah wasn't able to put up their offense. I have to assume that Utah is able to get a little bit more offense, that they're able to be a little bit better, and their defense is going to be, as good. And so 7.5 becomes an intriguing number, but I think they get the over. I think they have enough to be able to get there. For me, the wins are Cal Poly, at Wyoming, at West Virginia, Arizona State at home, Colorado at home, Cincinnati at home, and Kansas State at home. Over the years, Utah has had a really strong, pedigree of being able to win at home and in any of these tough environments being there. Last year was obviously a different case. You saw a lot of bad football being played at Rice-Eccles Stadium. But I'm going to go back with more of the trends here. And so I think some of these tougher games, a la Arizona State and Kansas State being played at home, that benefits them. My toss-up games are at UCLA. First game of the season, you never know what that's going to be. It's really easy to say that UCLA wasn't that great last year, but neither was Utah. And so it's really, really tough to know how these two teams are going to come out and work. Obviously, Nico Iamaleava is going to be the starting QB at UCLA. Has he gotten into a good rhythm through fall camp? He's getting a short time there. Has this become a challenge against a Utah defense that's going to make him pay? We'll see. He's done it against SEC defenses, so it's not to say that he can't do it. And that's where this becomes a challenge. Texas Tech becomes a toss-up. Utah gets them at home. It's first Big 12 game of the season. That's tough. And then at BYU, obviously can't predict that. At Baylor, at Kansas, all of those are up in the toss-up categories. So I'm not picking any losses for Utah. That's not because I don't think Utah's going to lose. They're going to lose. But I just don't know where that's going to be based on how this team is going to look, right? And so for that point, I'm taking the over on Utah, but they could get under. I just don't see the makeup of this team getting under. But this, like I said, this is a tough Pac or Big 12, and it's going to be a challenge, and somebody has to lose. So I'm not going to break down the rest of these teams, but I want to give you the win totals or the over-unders that are being expected. Houston at 6.5, TCU at 6.5. So that's kind of your next tier of teams that could be in the mix. TCU obviously has had a little bit more consistency over the years. Houston is on the up and up. I don't know that they're quite in the competition to compete for a Big 12 title. But I think they've made some moves in the transfer portal and done some things that allow them to be able to be in that mix. Then you've got Cincinnati and Colorado at 6 wins, Arizona at 5.5, UCF at 5.5, and then your bottom two, Oklahoma State and West Virginia at 5 apiece. As we talked about a couple weeks ago, I don't know that any of these bottom teams can get there. Maybe Oklahoma State can, but I just think based on how this goes, this is going to be a tall challenge. And look, I'm not going to bet the over-unders on any of those teams. I'm not interested in doing that right now, nor do I have the time. But I think that's where it's at. I don't think there's really any surprises out of this group. Maybe I could be wrong. I think Vegas, kind of has it tiered in an appropriate way. You can argue that some of them are, under in the sense that there's clearly not going to be 7.5 wins. It's going to be 8 wins or 9 wins or 10 wins, whatever that may be. But I think these are all pretty fair based on how the situation goes, right? I think Vegas did a good job of evaluating the talent that's coming in, evaluating what is returning, the trajectories of these programs, and I think that these are good over-under lines. Some make you think a little bit more than others, but I think it's been good. So that's kind of it for the over-unders. Really fascinating to kind of hear your guys' thoughts. If you guys want to hit me up on the tweet machine or on Blue Sky, you're more than welcome to. Let me know kind of your over-unders. Was I being too generous to some of these teams? I probably was, but it's May. I'm not going to get too into the nitty-gritty and truly understand a lot of these things yet because we don't. If you were to take a top 25 poll right now, which I know some people do, I have no interest in doing that at this point in the year. If you were to take that, there's going to be a lot of things that are going to look different, 4 weeks into the season. And I think that's a lot of what makes people mad about ranking teams. But I think this is just the nature of the sport, right? We want to see where your team compares to other people. Over-under lines are a good way of doing that because that's just the way that Vegas sees it. And so they've got money on the line. And so we'll kind of get there. So really, really fascinated. But like I said, 8 teams right there in the mix, probably with the tier 1, tier 2 of being able to compete for a Big 12 title. Obviously, some of those other teams that are in the lower categories can compete. I just think based on all these other teams, there's enough talent at the top 8 teams based on these predictions that I think that's going to be a challenge for any of these other teams to make a run. It can't be impossible, but I think the schedule's set up well for this, and we'll see how this goes. Honestly, as I was going through this, yes, I did say, okay, these are going to be wins for this team, losses for this team. I didn't go fully involved into it to see how that would shape up the race and who would finish where and what that is. But I think, it's an interesting conversation to kind of look at and kind of be in that mix. So that's it. Let's shift over now to recruiting. Recruiting is the lifeblood of every program, and it's taken on a different face over the last few years, especially in the NIL world, the transfer portal world, where a lot of teams are more focused on the transfer portal, right? You have at least something on tape where you can say, hey, we can go get this guy who's done X at X school, and you have a little bit more evaluation. It's still kind of a crapshoot in how they fit in with your program and whether they can, if you're pulling him in from the FCS ranks or you're pulling him in from a group of 5, how can they translate to a Power 4 school? Those things are part of that. But I think the hit rate is, I haven't seen any research on this, but I would imagine the hit rate is probably a little bit better through the transfer portal than the recruiting, freshmen's. But, both are still vital to each. You could take the Deion Sanders line where, he made headlines last year where he said, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing and probably putting words into his mouth somewhat, why invest in a bunch of freshmen when they're just going to hit the portal, right? He didn't say it quite like that. It was much more nuanced and basically said he doesn't need to take 25 kids in a freshman class, knowing that a majority of those kids aren't going to start. Maybe a few of those are going to get early looks to be able to play on the team, but a majority of those guys are going to be depth pieces, right? And so in his view, why spend the bulk of your time putting all of your eggs in that basket when you're essentially just becoming the feeder ground for other programs? And obviously, Deion can recruit a lot of the players that he wants and a lot of top tier talent, but at the same time, he wants to make sure that he's putting his resources in the right basket, right? You can disagree with that, and I think there's problems with that to some extent, but it's also not wrong anymore in this era, right? The transfer portal is one that churns pretty heavily, and guys are going to leave if they don't get starting time. Some of the position groups, they may stay a little bit longer, but that's the nature of it, right? If they don't feel any value or they don't feel like they're in a position where, in a year or two that they can start, they're going to bounce, especially as other programs look at them and say, hey, we could use you in our program right now. It becomes a challenge. So this is kind of the balance that Utah and all these schools are going to have to take. Are they going to, play a heavy hand in recruiting? Are they going to play the heavy hand in the transfer portal? As it stands, Kyle Whittingham has been very kind of even-keeled in how he has done this. He's gone pretty heavy in the transfer portal, especially this last year, to be able to retool an offense, but he's still, been able to bring in large classes of freshmen. Some years he hasn't. I think it was 2 years ago. I think they only brought in 15 players, if my numbers are, I remember that right. That was mostly because of the need or the lack of need that they had in terms of returning production. They had so many guys coming back that they didn't need that many freshmen. And so it's different. You can't make a wholesale look at that and say this is what they're doing. But by and large, I think, Kyle Whittingham / Utah is still pretty committed to bringing in recruits and trying to get guys to feed through their system. Quite honestly, it's the best way that they can, maybe not the best way, but it's one of the best ways that they can compete with some of these top tier programs. If you can continue to get them into your program and hopefully get them to mature through it, maybe you get some of those talent that other programs, haven't been looking at. And if you can keep them away from the transfer portal, then it works out for you. Utah isn't going to always be, the destination for players coming through the transfer portal. So you kind of have to have this balance at Utah. You have to look at it the right way. Even then, recruiting is still going to be hard for Utah. They have to approach it in a way where they have to know what their identity is, what they're going to get. They've obviously been good at evaluating talent, and so I think it's just more honing in on that even more and focusing on that. So this last week, I guess it's been 2 weeks now, Utah held its Under Armour next camp in Salt Lake City. This was at West High. This is where a lot of the top players from the region, not even top players, but a lot of the players from the region come and work out, do drills, do different things to kind of showcase themselves before coaches and other talent evaluators to get them ready for their senior season or even junior seasons to some extent, to be able to get ready for D1 commits and stuff like that. So there was a lot. I didn't have a chance to go this year simply because my son was playing in a tournament in Idaho, and that's where I was at. So dad duties trumped all that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of good talent there. A lot of people in the Western region that evaluators, the 24/7s, the on-3s, these types of the rivals, which is now on-3 essentially, they're looking at and evaluating high. And, from a bunch of the headlines that I read, Utah showed out, right? Especially with your trench players, your offensive line, defensive line. There was a lot of optimism about the types of players that are coming here. A lot of players that from this region are starting to get more attention. And the West, obviously, California is going to be the top dog. That's always going to be the case. There's just sheer numbers as well as just kind of resources. But I think, based on things that I've read, Utah continues to make its climb. Where they fit fully in the region remains to be seen. But there's been a clear indication that Utah's on the rise. And so that's why you're getting camps at like a West High where a lot of this talent is able to come and get their look. So a lot of these guys that we'll talk about here in a second are in there. Look, I'm not some recruiting guru. If you want to talk to them, you can go talk to any of the 24/7 or On3 or other people that are focused fully in on recruiting. But I pay attention to it, right? And this is something that I have to do for the job and something that I like to do. I think it's fun to kind of watch this, but I'm not going to be able to break down who these guys are. I don't watch their film, quite honestly. I might watch some of it. But for the most part, this is just kind of a brief overview of kind of where Utah stands. So like I said, if you want the recruiting news more heavily and you're that kind of nerdy into that, which I appreciate you, I'm not your guy. We'll just say that. So as it stands, Utah has 2 commits right now. I don't think that's unusual. Utah has always been kind of one that, as of late, has actually started to bring more into the summer and has gotten more commits that way. But for the most part, they've always been kind of more later in the calendar as they get closer to the early signing day. Utah, for the most part, doesn't even participate in the National Signing Day, which is in February. Most of their commits do come in that early class. And so Utah is working to try to expedite that process where they're now getting a lot of these commits in the summer and trying to lock things up before you get into fall so you can focus on the season as well as moving forward to the 27 commits, right? And trying to put all your eggs in their basket for the next class and trying to welcome them. There's still official visits that'll take place during the season, and there's still things happening there, but there's a lot of emphasis that gets kind of switched over to the 27 kids or the next year's kids once the season starts. That's how kind of Utah has started to evaluate that move. Like I said, there's still plenty that you have to do to lock up the current class, to make sure that there's still guys that want to be there. They're still actively involved in that. But I would say the majority of what's going to happen for Utah is going to likely come in this summer. So this will be a busy season. But as it stands, like I said, 2 players have committed to Utah. First one is Preston Pitts. He's a 3-star defensive end / linebacker. He's an edge guy. Comes from Texas, 6'4", 213 pounds. He committed in April, just after an official visit on April 17th. That was during the spring game. He was able to be there. I actually saw him at practice. And so he was, taking his official visit there. He does have one scheduled with Oklahoma State on June 12th. And so there's obviously still an attraction to other programs and trying to kind of vet his situation. But as it stands, he's committed, and from what I've heard, there doesn't seem to be any appetite to change that commitment yet. But with that scheduled visit to Oklahoma State, there's always a chance, and you'll see. Colby Simpson is the other commit right now. He's a 3-star tight end from California, 6'5", 222, kind of your prototypical size guy that you want. He committed back in March after an unofficial visit on March 29th, so he committed a day later. He also has one visit scheduled with Arkansas on June 6th. He hasn't officially taken a visit to Utah. I haven't seen anything to indicate that he has an official visit for Utah scheduled, but he has taken an unofficial. I would assume he probably takes one more during the season, since he is committed and everything. But there's a chance that happens and it gets it done. But Utah's doing well to kind of get some talent. Still need to get some more, but they're working to be able to get that, and we'll jump into that. But as it stands in the state of Utah specifically, as I talked about with the top recruits, Utah's class this year, the state of Utah, I should say, is one of the deepest that I've seen. There's been other classes that have maybe had higher top tier talent. But by and large, this is one of the deeper classes, and there's been a lot of good talent to come out of Utah. And unfortunately for the University of Utah, they haven't been able to really get any traction on a lot of these top guys. If I remember right, let's see, the top recruit, Celesi Moa, which I'll talk about in a sec, he's uncommitted, and he's actively, looking for a school that is there. This is the son of Ben Moa, former Utah player. But the next 5 are already committed, 2 of them going to BYU. BYU has been very active with this class for the state of Utah, and has been able to sign. But you've got Texas A&M, you've got UCLA, you've got other programs that have been able to get some of these top guys. So unlike a few years ago where Utah just basically locked down a lot of those top tier guys, this has been much more of a challenge for Utah. Some of that is based on fit. Some of that is based on how Utah was last year, right? Good momentum and trajectory go a long way. And unfortunately for Utah, the last 2 years just haven't gone their way. And that's going to play something in the portal, right? Or not the portal, the recruiting class. Guys want to see upward momentum, and they want to see how things are going. Obviously, you can explain a lot of these things, and you can look at that, and these coaches can explain that. But I think this year, more than years past, has just been a tougher challenge. Some of these guys, Utah hasn't also recruited heavily, some of these guys that are there. So it's not that it's always a miss, but it's not something that some of these kids have had any interest in coming to Utah. So it's kind of playing that balancing act. But as it stands, Utah has been less than successful with locking up a lot of the guys early, or at least getting guys that are leaning towards Utah. So with that said, we move into official visit season. So with schools getting out, and a lot of these guys getting ready to enter in their senior year, a lot of these guys are going to take their official visits over the summer. And this is the part of the year where Utah has been much more active than they ever have been. As I mentioned, they're trying to get a lot of these guys in for the early signing day. They're trying to get more guys in to be able to see the program and being able to just kind of commit them there, right? Last year, they had a record, 46 players come through on official visits. The year before that, they had a lot, but each year it continues to ramp up. Right now, they have 38 scheduled. But with that said, some of these guys are gonna, not end up going on their official visits. Utah's gonna schedule a lot more. It's just kind of a game that we play, and I'll try to keep you up to date with them. But for the most part, right now, 38 have been scheduled. If you look at last year, these become a very important part for Utah. Of the 46 visits that Utah had, 20 signed with Utah, and they were part of their signing class, right? There's actually 2 more, but they decided to decommit and go elsewhere. But 20 of those guys signed with Utah, and all of those guys came on an official visit. 13 of those committed in June or July. So those later parts of the official visits, usually the latter part of kind of that schedule that most has kind of been out there, if you can get that last impression and you can convince them, that becomes a good thing for them. And so Utah's been successful with that. You'll start to see some official visits coming up, and I'll talk about that in a sec, but you're going to start seeing a lot more commitments coming over the next, 3 months. And it's going to be Utah kind of taking shape, and we'll see kind of what they're focused on. As it stands, we can kind of see what they're focused on a little bit, but the biggest focus is going to be offensive line. There's a lot of reason to believe that Spencer Fano and Caleb Lomu are probably going to go to the NFL, assuming that the everything that is being projected and everything that is being talked about kind of goes that way. Utah's gearing up for that, right? They're gearing up to be able to say, hey, we expect these guys to go, and so you're going to see them push really heavily to try to get some of these top tier guys on the offensive line and rebuild that. And at Utah, they've shown that if you're a good freshman, we'll throw you in. And so I think that becomes a really attractive place for some of these guys who, maybe you got an offer from, let's say Michigan, but you might be 2 years until you start. At Utah, you at least have a chance to be able to get first team reps if you can come in and acclimate well, right? At least Utah has shown that with Spencer Fano and Caleb Lomu. He came a little bit later, but in terms that he came the next year. But it's a good recruiting pitch, and that's what Utah's working heavily to get. And so, we'll see what happens there. Right now, they've got 3 guys that are committed, or not committed, that are on schedule to be there for an official visit. All 3 are 4-star guys. One of them is a USC commit, and that's Isan Tafa. He committed a while back ago, but he gets the last visit of the calendar on June 20th, and so there's a chance that Utah can maybe try to flip that, kind of make their case there. But the 2 guys that are uncommitted right now and that have Utah in their top is Tommy Toffee. He actually visited during spring. It was on April 17th for the spring game, stuff like that. But he has Utah in his top 8 with Cal, Miami, Ohio State, Oregon, Tennessee, USC, and UCLA. So a lot of tough places to compete with. But I know that there is some mutual attraction there, right? Like I think there's some opportunity there for Utah, and so as much as he's in with the top tier guys, there's a chance there. And then one of the most recruited or heavily talked about guys has been Kelvin Obot. This is the top recruit from Idaho. It's a tackle. He put Utah in his top 4 with Michigan, Nebraska, and Oregon as his other teams. And so there's going to be a huge emphasis there. There's 3 other linemen they're doing, but I'm going to just mention the 4-star guys. Those are the ones that they're going to go after. There's some other obvious talents that they feel confident in and being able to get, but those are kind of more your top tier guys, the blue chippers, we'll call them, to be able to move forward. But these dates especially are going to be pretty important for Utah. You get a bunch that are coming in early. So you've got May 30th, which is going to be one of your bigger days, where 9 guys have so far been scheduled to come. That's clearly shows guys that they want to be there and they're interested in Utah, but it's so early in the schedule that it's tougher to hold on to some of those guys simply because they've got other visits lined up, right? And so the later on in the schedule, the better sometimes, because you can leave that last impression, but that doesn't always mean that you can't get some of these guys that are in the early date. Kelvin Olbot is in that early date, and I know for sure that he is, considering Utah, but he does have a lot of these other programs in there, and so it's going to be an interesting situation. But if you can get them to that June 20th date, which is kind of the unofficial last day for official visits, at least that's where most are taking theirs. There could be some after, and you can obviously get some in the season, but for the summer period, that's kind of the last time. you're going to have 12 players that are already scheduled for that. And so that becomes the big date where Utah puts all their eggs in their basket, trying to get a lot of these guys to come in and commit. This is going to be that last impression that I said. Some of these guys have already taken visits. Some of them may already have even committed by that point, and still may come to Utah to kind of see how it is. And so this is Utah's opportunity to kind of put the finishing touches on everything. So, as I said, 12 players in that session. So between that, you've got 21 guys of the 38 that are scheduled on 2 dates alone. The rest are kind of filled in between, but I think you're going to see Utah go pretty heavily there. As it stands, the rest of the class, how they're shaping up is they've got 5 corners visiting, 4 athletes, including Celesi Moa. He's in that May 30th date. This is a guy that can play both sides of the ball, legitimately play both sides of the ball, and has interest there. I believe Utah's recruiting him more on the offensive side of the ball, which is, I think you hear that, and a lot of guys always say that Utah just drools over any guy that can play the defense. But I think they see his talent, as a pass catcher, being able to really be effective there. But there is potential that if he wants, maybe he is playing on both sides of the ball, trying to do the Travis Hunter model, right? I know there's a lot of athletes that wish that, but I think Celesi, there's a real potential that he could do that. Outside of that, another 4-star athlete that Utah's bringing in is Chance Collins. He's also visiting on that day, so you get a look at that. Beyond that, you have 4 safeties coming in, 4 running backs with 4-star Victor Santino coming in June 13th, so in that middle period later in the schedule, good for Utah. 3 linebackers, 3 quarterbacks. One of them has already visited, and that's 4-star Peyton Falzone, but he's committed to Penn State. He had a connection with Jason Beck when he was at Syracuse. And there was legitimacy to Utah trying to get him, but it was always kind of Penn State, and so that one is not there. The one that they're going to be focusing on heavily is Oscar Rios. He's a dual threat guy. This is kind of their top tier quarterback that they're focusing in on for this class. There's some other guys that they can look at and other guys that are there, but this is the guy that they're focused on, and he's coming in June 6th, so kind of that middle period. He's got a lot of active suitors as well. He's going to be a hot name, and he continues to get more attention from programs. So it'll be a tall task to be able to get that, but Utah's working hard, and they've had a deep connection with him for a very long time. So we'll see there. And then outside of that, wide receivers, they've got 3 so far. So the rest, there's more players in there that are there, but it's less than 3. And so this is going to be an active season. It's going to be a crazy time. As I start looking at these schedule breakdowns, we're going to talk about some of these guys that have visited, kind of what they've said, stuff like that. And so we'll get into it. But like I said, I'm not going to be your recruiting guy in terms of going deep and saying, okay, this is how he can fit. At least in generalities I can, but I'm not going to go in and say break down his tape and say this is how he could be or whatever, or this is how he'll fit, that kind of stuff. So that's going to be it for today. As I said, we may come back a little bit later this week to be able to talk about kind of what's happening around college football, college athletics in general. But by and large, we'll probably come back next week and start our schedule breakdown and get into the weeds. Let's do it. Let's start talking football. Let's get it on, a schedule breakdown, see how Utah goes. So with that, thank you for listening. I appreciate you listening each week and tuning in. If there's anything you ever want me to talk about or have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can email me at jfurlong@ksl.com, or you can hit me up on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. I still call it Twitter, or Blue Sky. So with that, signing off today. Have a great one.